The bell above the door of the Gilded Spoon chimed its delicate tinkling song, a sound Amelia Vance had come to associate with the scent of burnt sugar and stale ambition. For 3 years, this cafe had been her world, a purgatory of polished mahogany and overpriced lattes that paid for her art history textbooks. She moved between the tables with a practiced, weary grace, her smile a carefully constructed mask that hid the mounting dread of student loans and a future as uncertain as the foam art. She swirled onto cappuccinos. Most days were a blur of the same faces. The laptop warriors nursing a single coffee for 6 hours, the gossiping mothers with their double strollers, the hurried businessmen barking orders into their phones. And then there was Mr. Alistair Blackwood. He wasn't just a customer, he was a fixture, an unwelcome monument to new money and old-world arrogance. He always took table 7, the one by the large bay window, not for the view of the bustling street, but so the street could have a view of him. He dressed in suits that cost more than Amelia's semester tuition, his cufflinks gleaming, his shoes reflecting the ceiling lights with a blinding polish. He spoke to the staff not as people, but as inconvenient necessities, his voice a low, condescending drawl that made Amelia's teeth ache. But there was another fixture in her daily view, one who occupied the space just outside the bay window. He was a man with no name she knew, a ghost haunting the periphery of their warm, fragrant world. He was homeless, that much was clear from his frayed coat that had seen too many winters and the deep, weary lines etched into his face. Yet he held himself with a strange, quiet dignity. He never begged, he never bothered anyone. He would simply find a dry spot on the pavement, his back against the cool brick of the building, and watch the city flow by with eyes that seemed to hold a universe of forgotten stories. Amelia and some of the other staff had taken to calling him Arthur, after the legendary king, because of the noble, almost regal set of his jaw, even when it was shadowed with grime and stubble. On this particular Tuesday, the sky wept a cold, relentless rain. Each gust of wind sent sheets of water skittering across the pavement, turning the world outside the cafe into a miserable grey watercolour. Amelia watched as Arthur huddled deeper into his thin coat, his shoulders shaking from a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her heart clenched. She'd snuck him hot coffee on colder days, left a bag with a sandwich and a pastry by the bins when her manager, Mr. Peterson, wasn't looking. But today felt different. The rain was cruel, and the thought of him out there, soaked to the bone, was a weight she couldn't bear. The bell chimed. It wasn't Blackwood, not yet. It was a lull in the lunchtime rush. Mr. Peterson was in the back, wrestling with inventory. Taking a deep breath, Amelia filled a heavy ceramic mug with steaming coffee, grabbed a thick slice of banana bread from the display, and walked to the door. She pushed it open, the wind snatching at her apron. "Arthur," she called out softly. He looked up, his pale blue eyes startled, like a deer caught in headlights. They were surprisingly clear, intelligent eyes. It's too cold out here," she said, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Please, come inside, just for a little while, to get warm." He hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the warm, golden light of the cafe, then back to his sodden patch of sidewalk. It was a sanctuary he clearly felt he had no right to enter. I can't," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. "I have no money." "It's on me," Amelia insisted, holding out the mug. The steam billowed from it like a tiny, hopeful cloud. "No one will bother you, I promise. There's a small table in the back, by the kitchen, please." For a long moment he stared at her, a complicated emotion swirling in his eyes, gratitude mixed with a profound, bone-deep shame. Finally, with a slow, pained nod, he gathered his small, wet bag and rose to his feet. He moved with a stiff, arthritic grace, his tall frame stooped as if carrying an invisible burden. He followed her inside, dripping a small puddle onto the pristine tiles, his eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make himself as small as possible. Amelia settled him at the tiny forgotten table in the corner, a space usually reserved for bussing trays. She placed the coffee and bread in front of him. "My name is Amelia," she said gently. He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Thank you, Amelia," he whispered, and the way he said her name held a strange formal beauty. He wrapped his chapped, trembling hands around the warm mug as if it were a lifeline. Amelia felt a small victory, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the cafe's heating. She turned back to the counter, her manufactured smile feeling, for the first time that day, completely genuine. She was so focused on the simple act of kindness, on the quiet man in the corner, that she didn't hear the bell chime again until the cold, imperious voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. "What in God's name is that smell?" Amelia's stomach plummeted. Mr. Alistair Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, shaking a ridiculously expensive umbrella onto the welcome mat, his face contorted in a mask of pure disgust. His eyes scanned the cafe, dismissing the other patrons, until they landed on the small, huddled figure in the corner. His lip curled. "You," he snapped, pointing a manicured finger not at Arthur, but at Amelia. "What is that vagrant doing in here? Is this a cafe or a public shelter?" The small bubble of warmth Amelia had felt instantly burst, replaced by a familiar chilling dread. The confrontation she had hoped to avoid had just walked through the door, and it was wearing a $1,000 suit. The atmosphere in the Gilded Spoon, usually a gentle hum of conversation and clinking porcelain, had frozen solid. Every eye in the cafe was now fixed on the unfolding drama. Alistair Blackwood strode towards the counter, his polished shoes clicking an angry rhythm on the tile floor. He completely ignored the other customers waiting to order, planting his hands on the marble countertop and leaning towards Amelia. His voice a venomous whisper that carried through the entire room. "I pay a premium to enjoy my coffee in a clean, respectable establishment," he hissed, his cologne an acrid wave of sandalwood and entitlement. "Not to be accosted by the stench of the gutter. Get him out. Now." Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she wiped down a non-existent spot on the counter. "He's a paying customer, sir," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. The lie was a flimsy shield, but it was the only one she had. Blackwood let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A paying customer? With what? The lint in his pockets? Do not insult my intelligence, girl. I know exactly what this is. You, with your bleeding heart charity, have decided to invite filth into a private business. It's unsanitary. It's disgusting. It's bad for business." He gestured around the room with a sweep of his hand. "My business?" In the corner, Arthur had shrunk even further into himself. He hadn't touched his banana bread. His hands were still wrapped around the mug, but his head was bowed, his face hidden as if he could will himself to disappear. The shame radiating from him was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak that seemed to smother the air around him. Just then, Mr. Peterson, the cafe's manager, emerged from the back room, his face a mask of harried anxiety. He was a man perpetually out of his depth, a small boat in a big storm. Seeing Alistair Blackwood at the counter, his face pale with fury, Mr. Peterson's shoulders slumped in preemptive defeat. "Mr. Blackwood, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice squeaking with a desperate attempt at bonhomie. Blackwood turned his glare on the manager, and it was like watching a predator turn on weaker prey. "A problem, Peterson?" "Yes, you could say there's a problem." He pointed a rigid finger towards Arthur. "Your staff is running a soup kitchen on my time. I want him removed, immediately, or I will take my considerable business elsewhere, and I will make it my personal mission to see that every one of my associates does the same. I will write reviews. I will call the health department. I will ruin this place." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Mr. Peterson wilted. He wrung his hands, his gaze darting from Blackwood's furious face to Arthur's bowed head, and finally to Amelia, a silent plea in his eyes. He was a man of profit margins and customer satisfaction surveys, not moral courage. "Amelia," he began, his voice barely a whisper, perhaps the gentleman has finished his coffee." "He just got here," Amelia shot back, her own voice rising, laced with an indignation that surprised even herself. "It's pouring rain outside. He's not bothering anyone." "He is bothering me," Blackwood roared, slamming his palm flat on the counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent cafe. "His very presence is an offense. This is not a debate. Peterson, handle this, or I will." Mr. Peterson, now sweating visibly, scurried from behind the counter. He approached Arthur's table with the hesitant, shuffling steps of a man walking to his own execution. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling, I'm terribly sorry, but we're going to have to ask you to leave." Arthur looked up, and the profound sadness in his eyes struck Amelia like a physical blow. There was no anger, no defiance, only a deep, weary resignation, as if this was a scene he had played out 1,000 times before. He slowly, deliberately, placed the mug back on the table, its warmth now a cruel mockery. He hadn't taken a single sip. He began to rise, his movements stiff and slow. But Blackwood was not a patient man. The very sight of the man's quiet dignity seemed to enrage him further. "Oh, for heaven's sake, we don't have all day," Blackwood snarled, striding past the hapless manager. He reached Arthur's table in 2 long steps. "Let me help you up." Before anyone could react, Blackwood grabbed Arthur's left arm, his fingers digging into the thin, damp fabric of the old coat. He yanked hard. The motion was brutal, dismissive, the way one might pull a weed from a pristine garden. It was in that single, violent moment that everything changed. The fabric of the coat sleeve, already worn thin by time and weather, gave way. It didn't just tear, it shredded, ripping from the elbow to the wrist with a sickening sound. The sleeve fell away, exposing the pale, surprisingly unweathered skin of Arthur's forearm. And there, stark against the pale skin, was the tattoo. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind, usually occupied with coffee orders and textbook deadlines, froze, every single thought screeching to a halt. It wasn't a crude, homemade tattoo or a faded military insignia. It was a work of art, intricate and impossibly detailed, even after what must have been decades. It was a crest. A regal, stylized lion with a crown of silver stars, rampant over a mountain range, all encircled by a wreath of what looked like edelweiss. The lines were fine, the shading subtle, the heraldry unmistakable. The world seemed to slow down, the ambient noise of the cafe fading into a dull roar in her ears. She wasn't seeing a homeless man's arm anymore. She was seeing page 247 of The Lost Houses of Europe, a textbook she had been studying just last night for her seminar on deposed monarchies. She was seeing the royal crest of the House of Valerius, the ruling family of the tiny, forgotten principality of Eldoria, a nation that had been swallowed by its neighbors in the political turmoil following the Great War. Blackwood, blinded by his own rage, saw nothing but the arm of a man he despised. He continued to pull, dragging Arthur towards the door. But Amelia was no longer a waitress. She was a historian who had just stumbled upon a living, breathing artifact. "Stop!" The word tore from her throat, sharp and commanding, utterly unlike her usual quiet demeanor. It cut through the tension with the force of a physical blow. Blackwood paused, halfway to the door, turning to look at her with sheer astonishment. Mr. Peterson stared, his mouth agape. The entire cafe was holding its collective breath. Amelia walked forward, her eyes locked on the crest. She didn't see Alistair Blackwood, the bully. She didn't even see Arthur, the homeless man. She saw a ghost from a history book, a myth made flesh. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the man's arm, her voice a hushed, disbelieving whisper that only he and Blackwood could hear. "That crest," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That is the Lion of Eldoria." Alistair Blackwood stared at Amelia as if she had suddenly started speaking in tongues. His grip on Arthur's arm loosened for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The what of what?" he scoffed, his anger momentarily eclipsed by sheer bewilderment. "What nonsense are you babbling about, girl? It's a tattoo." But Arthur, who had been passive and defeated, flinched at her words as if she had struck him. His head snapped up, and for the first time his eyes met hers with a look of raw, unadulterated panic. He tried to pull his arm away, to hide the exposed mark, a desperate, instinctual gesture of a man whose deepest secret had just been dragged into the light. His reaction was all the confirmation Amelia needed. Her mind was racing, connecting dots at lightning speed. The noble bearing, the formal, educated whisper of his voice, the profound, almost tragic sadness in his eyes, and now the crest, the silver-crowned lion of the Valerius dynasty. It wasn't just a copy, the aging of the ink, the way it settled into the lines of his skin. It looked authentic, old. "Let go of him," Amelia said again, her voice low and steady, imbued with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She took another step forward, placing herself directly between Blackwood and his victim. "Are you insane?" Blackwood snarled, tightening his grip again. "Get out of my way before I have you fired." "That tattoo is the royal crest of Eldoria," Amelia stated, her eyes not leaving the mark on Arthur's arm. "It was the personal sigil of the royal family. They were all thought to have perished in the fire at the Winter Palace in 1958, all except one, the youngest son. He was only a boy. They said he vanished, presumed dead." A ripple of murmurs went through the other patrons. The scene had transformed from an ugly but common confrontation into something strange and compelling. Phones were discreetly being raised. Blackwood's face, which had been a mask of rage, was now flickering with uncertainty. He looked from Amelia's intensely serious face to the crest on the old man's arm and then back again. He was a man who prided himself on knowing things, on being in control. This was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "This is absurd. He's a bum who probably got that from a Cracker Jack box. Now get out of the way." He made to shove past her, but Amelia stood her ground. "The crown," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the tattoo. "Count the stars. There are 5. The king's crest had 7. The crown prince's had 6. The 5-star crown was reserved exclusively for the second son, for Prince Arthurian." She looked directly into Arthur's pale blue eyes, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Your name," she whispered, the question hanging in the air, heavy with impossible meaning. "Is it Arthur?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. A storm of emotions was raging across his face, fear, shame, and a grief so ancient it seemed to have been carved into his very bones. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. That single tear was more eloquent than any confession. The tension in the cafe finally snapped. A woman at a nearby table, a well-dressed lady in her 60s, stood up. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm. "Leave the poor man alone. Can't you see you've distressed him?" Another man, one of the laptop warriors, closed his computer with a decisive snap. "The lady is right. Back off." Blackwood looked around, suddenly finding himself the villain in a story that had spiraled beyond his control. The patrons were no longer passive observers, they were a jury, and their verdict was clear. His face flushed a deep, mottled red, a mixture of fury and humiliation. He was a man who thrived on public perception, and he was losing the room fast. He finally released Arthur's arm, shoving him away with a final gesture of contempt. Arthur stumbled back, catching himself on the edge of the table, his breathing ragged. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood spat, trying to regain some semblance of his authority. He pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Peterson, who was still frozen like a statue. "Peterson, you will hear from my lawyer. This establishment is a pathetic joke." He then turned his venomous glare back to Amelia. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with malice, "you're a fool. A deluded little girl playing make-believe." He straightened his suit jacket, cast one last look of utter revulsion at Arthur, and stormed out of the cafe. The bell above the door chimed violently, a frantic, angry sound that seemed to signal his defeat. The moment he was gone, the collective breath of the cafe was released. Mr. Peterson rushed forward, not to Arthur, but to the door, peering out as if to ensure Blackwood was truly gone. The other patrons began to talk in hushed, excited tones. But Amelia saw none of it. Her world had contracted to the man in the corner, who now stood trembling, his torn sleeve hanging in tatters, his secret identity laid bare on his arm for all to see. He looked utterly broken, exposed. Ignoring her manager, ignoring the curious stares, Amelia gently took his uninjured arm. "Come with me," she said softly. "Let's get you out of here." She led him past the gawking customers, through the swinging doors of the kitchen, and into the relative quiet of the staff break room. It was a small, cluttered space with a few lockers and a rickety table. She sat him down on one of the chairs. He was shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from shock. She grabbed the small first aid kit from the wall. His arm, where Blackwood had grabbed him, was already beginning to show the dark, ugly bloom of a bruise. As she gently dabbed the skin with an antiseptic wipe, her mind reeled. This man, this quiet, dignified soul who slept on the streets, could be a prince. A lost prince from a forgotten kingdom. It was the stuff of fairy tales, of the history books she so loved. But the bruise on his arm, the tear on his cheek, the raw terror in his eyes, this was no fairy tale. This was real, and it was happening in the back room of a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He still hadn't spoken a word. He just stared at the floor, his long, tangled grey hair hiding his face. Amelia finished cleaning his arm and then sat in the chair opposite him, giving him space. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant clatter of the kitchen and the drumming of the rain against the roof. Finally, she broke it, her voice barely a whisper. "Is it true?" He lifted his head slowly, and his eyes, ancient and exhausted, met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And in that silent gesture, 100 years of history, a lost kingdom, and a forgotten tragedy came crashing down into the tiny, cluttered break room of the Gilded Spoon. The hours after Alistair Blackwood's departure passed in a surreal haze for Amelia. Mr. Peterson, after a brief, flustered attempt at a reprimand that dissolved into panicked muttering about lawsuits, left her alone. He seemed more terrified of the potential fallout than angry at her insubordination. The other patrons, their lunchtime drama concluded, eventually filtered out, leaving behind a cafe buzzing with the residue of the strange event. Her co-worker, a cynical young man named Leo, handled the remaining customers, casting curious glances towards the kitchen doors. Amelia ignored it all. Her focus was entirely on the man sitting before her. She had made him a cup of sweet tea, and he was holding it in his hands, the shaking having finally subsided. He still hadn't offered his name, and she hadn't pressed. The single nod had been enough for now. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," she said gently, breaking the long silence. Her own shift was ending soon. "My apartment is a few blocks away. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can have a hot shower. I have a sweater and some sweatpants my dad left behind. They'll be big on you, but they'll be dry." He looked up at her, his expression one of deep mistrust, not of her, but of kindness itself. It was as if he'd been conditioned to expect a price for every good deed. "Why?" he rasped, his voice rough. "Why are you doing this?" Amelia thought for a moment. The answer was complicated. It had started as simple pity, a human response to seeing another suffer. But now, it was more. It was the historian in her, buzzing with the discovery of a lifetime. It was the storyteller, desperate to know the narrative behind his haunted eyes. But most of all, it was a profound sense of duty, a feeling that she had, by sheer chance, stumbled upon a great injustice that she couldn't simply walk away from. "Because no one deserves to be treated like that," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "And because I think I'm the only person in this city who knows who you are." That seemed to break through his defenses. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to age him another decade. He nodded again, another small, defeated gesture. The journey to her apartment was a quiet, tense affair. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle. Amelia gave him her own umbrella, and he held it with an awkward formality, trying to shield them both. People on the street gave them a wide berth, their eyes flicking from Amelia's neat waitress uniform to Arthur's ragged, torn coat, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Amelia felt a hot flush of anger. Before today, she might have been one of them, casting a passing, pitying glance. Now she felt like a bodyguard, fiercely protective of the quiet, broken man walking beside her. Her apartment was a small third-floor walk-up, crammed with books and smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. It was her sanctuary. To her surprise, he didn't seem to notice the clutter or the cramped space. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the prints and photographs taped to her walls. Reproductions of famous paintings, architectural diagrams of old castles, and on the wall above her desk, a detailed hand-drawn map of pre-war Central Europe. His gaze lingered on a small mountainous region nestled between larger, more familiar countries. Eldoria. While he showered, Amelia rummaged through her closet, finding the clothes she'd promised. The sound of the running water was a steady, calming presence in the small apartment. She made more tea and a couple of sandwiches, her hands working on autopilot while her mind spun. Prince Arthurian Valerius of Eldoria. He was supposed to be dead. The official story was that the entire royal family, save for the king who was on a diplomatic mission, had been trapped in the royal palace when a terrible fire broke out during a winter storm. The bodies were never properly identified, but the tragedy was absolute. The king abdicated a year later, broken by grief, and the powerless principality was peacefully annexed by its neighbor. But the rumors had always persisted. Whispers of the young second son, a boy of 10, who had supposedly escaped the flames, spirited away by a loyal guard. The stories had faded over the decades, relegated to conspiracy theories and historical footnotes. The water shut off. A few minutes later, he emerged from the bathroom looking like a different person. His face and hands were scrubbed clean, revealing the fine bone structure beneath the grime. His long grey hair was damp and combed back, showing a high, intelligent forehead. The clothes were too big, as she'd predicted, but they were clean and dry. He looked less like a homeless man and more like a weary traveller, a scholar who had fallen on hard times. He moved with a newfound hesitancy, as if unaccustomed to the simple comforts of walls and warmth. He accepted the sandwich and tea with a quiet thank you, and for a while they sat in silence at her small kitchen table. Amelia didn't push. She let him eat, let him gather himself. When he was finished, he placed the plate neatly to the side and finally looked at her, his blue eyes clear and piercing. "You are a student of history," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Amelia replied, "art history with a focus on European heraldry and monarchies." He nodded slowly. A cruel irony. He gestured vaguely at himself, that my ghost should be found by the one person who could recognize it. He fell silent again, and Amelia knew this was the moment. She had to ask. She went to her desk and pulled out the heavy textbook, The Lost Houses of Europe. She opened it to the chapter on Eldoria, to the page with the black and white photograph of the royal family, taken a year before the fire. The king, stern and bearded. The queen, beautiful and sad-eyed. The crown prince, a serious-looking teenager. And beside him, a small boy of about 9, with a mischievous smile and the same clear, intelligent eyes that were now staring back at her from across the table. The caption read, "Prince Arthurian." She slid the open book across the table. He stared at the photograph for a long, long time. His hand, clean but still chapped, rose and hovered over the image of the smiling boy, his fingers trembling, not daring to touch the page. "I was supposed to be in my room," he began, his voice a low, haunted whisper. "But I had snuck out to the kitchens to steal a piece of cake. I was always willful." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. "My guard, a good man named Captain Brandt, found me. He was scolding me, dragging me back through the service corridors when we heard the first explosion." He stared into the middle distance, his eyes seeing not the cluttered apartment, but the burning palace of his memory. "It wasn't an accident, Amelia. The storm, the fire. It was a cover. There were men. Not our guards. They had guns. Brandt knew. He didn't take me towards the royal chambers. He took me away, down into the cellars, through an old smuggling tunnel that led out to the woods. He told me my family was gone, that the people who did this would be looking for me. He told me that Prince Arthurian had to die in that fire with everyone else." He took a shaky breath. "We ran for weeks. Brandt had contacts, old soldiers loyal to my father. They got us across the border. He gave me a new name, taught me to be invisible. He raised me as his own son in a small town in France. But they found us. When I was 17, they came for us. Brandt died getting me away. He died for me." The pain in his voice was raw, a wound that had never healed. "I have been running ever since. I have been a dishwasher, a farmhand, a bookseller, a ghost. I had money once. Brandt had managed to secure a small portion of my family's private funds. But it was stolen. I was betrayed by someone I trusted. And I ended up here. It is easier to be no one when you have nothing. No one looks for a prince in the gutter. Until today." He finally looked down at his own arm, at the faded blue-black crest that had defined and destroyed his life. "My father had this done for me on my 5th birthday. A family tradition. He said it meant I would never be lost. He said it would always show me the way home." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "It has done nothing but remind me that I have no home to go to." Amelia sat in stunned silence, the sheer weight of his story settling over her. This was the truth behind the historical footnote, the life lived in the margins of a tragedy. He wasn't just a discovery, he was a man who had lost everything. His family, his name, his world. She had unearthed his secret, and now she had no idea what to do with it. But as she looked at the profound sorrow in his eyes, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let him go back to the streets. She had, in her own way, brought Prince Arthurian back from the dead. And now she felt responsible for him. The next few days were a strange, delicate dance of building trust. Arthur, he insisted she call him Arthur, stating that the prince had died long ago, was a quiet and unobtrusive houseguest. He slept on her lumpy sofa, folding the blankets with military precision each morning. He was meticulously clean, washing his few dishes immediately, insisting on helping with any small chore. It was clear he was desperate not to be a burden. He spoke little about his past, having already given her the brutal, condensed version. Instead, he seemed to gravitate towards her books, pulling volumes from her shelves and reading for hours, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to reconnect with a world from which he had been exiled for half a century. For Amelia, life had been split into two distinct periods, before Arthur and after. Her shifts at the Gilded Spoon were fraught with a new kind of tension. Mr. Peterson treated her with a nervous, wide-eyed respect, terrified of what she might know or do. Her co-worker, Leo, pestered her with questions she deftly avoided. The customers who had witnessed the event would watch her, whispering amongst themselves. The story of the crazy waitress and the secret prince had become a piece of local cafe gossip. But of Alistair Blackwood there was no sign. He had vanished, and Amelia felt a sense of both relief and unease. A man like that did not simply accept humiliation and walk away. Her real life began when her shift ended. She would hurry home to the small apartment that now felt more like a safe house. She and Arthur would share simple meals, and slowly, tentatively, he began to open up. He wouldn't speak of the fire or the years on the run, but he would talk about Eldoria. He described the sharp, clean scent of the mountain pines, the taste of the wild strawberries that grew on the castle grounds, the sound of the royal orchestra practicing in the mornings. He spoke of his mother's kindness, his father's stern but fair hand. He was rebuilding his own history, piece by piece, through the act of telling it to her. Amelia, in turn, became a woman possessed by a singular purpose. Her academic interest had morphed into a deeply personal crusade. She spent every spare moment in the university library, diving deeper into the history of Eldoria. She cross-referenced old newspaper articles, diplomatic cables, and obscure historical journals. The official story of the fire was tidy, too tidy. An old electrical fault, a tragic accident. But she found whispers, hints in the margins. An article mentioning that the king had been in tense negotiations with a powerful neighboring conglomerate over Eldoria's rich, untapped mineral resources. A footnote in a biography about a rival nobleman with a distant claim to the throne who had conveniently come into a great deal of money shortly after the accident. She felt like she was piecing together a puzzle in the dark. The more she learned, the more she realized that Arthur's whispered belief that the fire was deliberate was likely the truth. He wasn't just the victim of a tragedy, he was the survivor of an assassination. One evening, she came home with a stack of photocopied articles and a new, heavy book on European jewelry. She found Arthur staring out the window, a familiar, haunted look on his face. "I found something," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. She spread the papers out on the coffee table. The negotiations. It was with a corporation called Blackwood Industries. Arthur turned from the window, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do not know that name." "It was founded in the late 1940s by a man named Silas Blackwood," Amelia explained, her finger tracing the name in an old financial report. "He was ruthless. He wanted the mining rights in the Eldorian mountains. Your father refused. He said it would destroy the landscape, poison the rivers. He was a staunch environmentalist long before it was fashionable. The connection was tenuous, but it was there. A motive. A powerful family that had been denied something they desperately wanted. Just before the Eldorian royal family was conveniently wiped out. Silas Blackwood had one son," Amelia continued, her heart starting to beat faster. He inherited the company and expanded it. His name was Alistair. Our Mr. Blackwood is Alistair Blackwood II. It's his grandson. A heavy silence filled the room. The confrontation in the cafe was no longer a random act of classist cruelty. It was a chilling echo of a dark history, a collision of past and present. Alistair Blackwood wasn't just a bully, he was the scion of the family that may have destroyed Arthur's entire world. But he couldn't know, Arthur said, shaking his head. It is impossible. It was just a coincidence. Is it? Amelia countered. Alistair Blackwood is a known collector of rare artifacts, especially those related to lost European nobility. He sees them as status symbols. He's been trying to acquire the last known significant Eldorian artifact for years. She opened the jewelry book to a chapter on royal regalia. There, in a full-page color photograph, was a stunning signet ring. It was heavy gold, bearing the same 5-star lion crest as the one on Arthur's arm. The caption read, "The Ring of the Second Son, House of Valerius. Current whereabouts unknown." He's been hunting for this ring, Amelia whispered. He believes it's the last piece of the puzzle, the ultimate prize for his collection. If he knew who you were, if he suspected you were alive, it wouldn't just complicate his collection, it would threaten his family's entire legacy. It would mean his grandfather wasn't just a shrewd businessman, he was a murderer and a usurper. Arthur stared at the picture of the ring, his face pale. He unconsciously reached up and touched a thin leather cord around his neck, hidden beneath the collar of his borrowed shirt. Amelia had noticed it before, but had assumed it was a simple keepsake. Slowly, his fingers fumbled with a small knot. He pulled the cord over his head. Hanging from it was not a locket or a pendant, but the very ring from the photograph. It was worn with age, the gold soft and dull, but it was unmistakably the same. The lion, the 5 stars, the heavy, regal design. Brant gave it to me the night we escaped, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He took it from my finger so I wouldn't be identified. He told me to keep it hidden, always, to never show it to anyone. He held the ring in the palm of his hand, the last physical remnant of his stolen life. It was proof. It was his birthright. And in the hands of a man like Alistair Blackwood, it was a death sentence. The pieces were no longer just historical facts on a page. They were a clear and present danger. Blackwood's interest wasn't just academic or financial, it was personal. He had to ensure the Eldorian line remained extinct, that the last prince remained a ghost. And now, thanks to Amelia, he had a face to hunt. The quiet unease she had felt since his disappearance curdled into genuine fear. Alistair Blackwood wasn't gone. He was gathering information, he was planning his next move, and they had just handed him the map. The revelation of the ring changed the atmosphere in the small apartment from a quiet sanctuary to a tense waiting room. The weight of the small piece of gold felt immense, a tangible link to a violent past and an uncertain future. Arthur began wearing it on the cord under his shirt again, but now it seemed less like a memento and more like a target. The city outside the window no longer looked like a bustling metropolis. It looked like a hunting ground. Amelia's fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She started double-checking the lock on her door, jumping at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She imagined Blackwood's face everywhere, in the reflection of a shop window, in the crowd on the subway. She knew his type. He was a man who used wealth and power not just to get what he wanted, but to crush anything that stood in his way. He wouldn't let the matter of the vagrant prince rest, not when it threatened the very foundation his family's fortune was built upon. Her fears were confirmed 3 days later. She was at the university library, supposedly studying for a midterm, but in reality she was digging through Blackwood Industries' corporate archives, looking for anything that might help them. She found a reference to a long-standing subsidiary, a private security firm called Argent Solutions. It was known for its discretion and its ethically questionable tactics, often employed by the ultra-rich for problem-solving. A chill went down her spine. She packed her books quickly, a sense of urgency propelling her out of the library and into the cold afternoon air. As she hurried down the street towards her apartment, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the road from her building. It was sleek, expensive, and had tinted windows. It hadn't been there that morning. It could be a coincidence, but her instincts screamed that it wasn't. She took a detour, circling the block and coming up the back alley. She let herself in through the service entrance, her heart pounding. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her keys already in her hand. As she reached her floor, she heard voices from inside her apartment. One was Arthur's, quiet and strained. The other was a voice she recognized with a jolt of pure dread. It was the cold, arrogant drawl of Alistair Blackwood. Her blood ran cold. How had he found them? How had he gotten in? She fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking too much to dial 911. She crept closer to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. A rather persistent delusion, Blackwood was saying, his voice oozing with false sympathy. I can imagine life on the streets could do that to a man's mind. You start to believe your own fantasies. A forgotten prince, how wonderfully romantic. Leave this place, Arthur said. His voice was steady, but Amelia could hear the tremor of fear beneath it. Oh, I will, Blackwood replied smoothly. But first, we need to clear up this little misunderstanding. You see, I've made some inquiries. The young waitress, Amelia, is a history student. A rather imaginative one, it seems. She's been filling your head with stories, hasn't she? Giving you ideas above your station. There was a soft thud, as if something had been dropped on the coffee table. My family has been peripherally interested in the Eldorian tragedy for some time, purely from a historical perspective. We even funded a scholarship for its study. We have access to all the records, the real records, and they are quite clear. There were no survivors. Prince Arthurian died with his family. You are lying, Arthur stated flatly, a humorless chuckle. Am I? Or are you? Let's be practical. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you are who you think you are. What then? You have no proof, no allies, no money. You are a ghost, a non-entity. Coming forward would achieve nothing but chaos and embarrassment for you. However, I am a compassionate man. Amelia could hear the sound of a briefcase clicking open. I am prepared to offer you a sum, Blackwood continued, his voice turning oily and persuasive. A generous sum. Enough to get you off the streets forever. A small apartment, a comfortable life, anonymity. All you have to do is disappear. Forget these silly stories, forget Eldoria, forget the name Arthurian. In return for my generosity, I would only ask for one small thing. A trinket you might have. A family heirloom. A ring, perhaps. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Amelia held her breath, her hand clapped over her mouth. He knew about the ring. So the stories are true. Arthur's voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. You know who I am. I know that you are a problem. Blackwood's voice turned hard as steel, all pretense of compassion gone. A loose end my grandfather should have tied up 60 years ago. He was a visionary, but he could be sentimental. He left one of the guards alive, a man who later died in a bar fight in Marseille. A pity. It would have saved me this inconvenience. He was admitting it. He was admitting to everything, right inside her apartment. That ring, Blackwood demanded, is the last piece of evidence that could ever link my family to that unfortunate accident. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. Give it to me, and you can walk away. Refuse, and I will simply take it. And then I will make sure you disappear so completely that not even your ghost remains. Do you understand me? Amelia knew she had to do something. She couldn't let Arthur face this alone. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her gut. But something else was rising to meet it. Rage, a fierce, protective anger. She took a deep breath, unlocked her phone, and hit the record button on the voice memo app. Then, gripping her keys like a weapon, she unlocked the door and threw it open. Get out of my house, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Blackwood and Arthur both spun around. Arthur's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear for her. Blackwood, however, looked merely annoyed, as if a fly had buzzed into the room. Standing beside him was a large, imposing man in a dark suit. Argent Solutions, no doubt. The man who had likely picked the lock on her door. Ah, the little historian, Blackwood sneered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Just in time, I was just making your friend here a very generous offer. Perhaps you can talk some sense into him. I heard your offer, Amelia said, holding her phone up slightly, and I'm recording your confession. Blackwood's smile faltered for a second before returning, more menacing than before. A recording? How quaint. Do you really think that will matter? A garbled recording from a delusional waitress? My lawyers would shred you before you even reached a courtroom. You have nothing, no power, no influence. He took a step towards her, his eyes cold and predatory. You should have stayed out of this, Amelia. You have no idea the world you've stumbled into. This is not a history seminar. This is about legacy and power and fortunes so vast you cannot even comprehend them. Now, give me the phone, and I might forget you were ever involved. The large man started to move towards her, but before he could take a second step, Arthur moved with a speed that belied his age. He stepped in front of Amelia, shielding her with his own body. He was no longer the broken, defeated man from the cafe. His back was straight, his shoulders square. The years of hardship seemed to fall away, revealing the shadow of the prince he once was. You will not touch her, he said, his voice ringing with an authority that had been buried for 60 years. You have taken everything from me, my family, my home, my name. You will not take anything else. He reached under his shirt and pulled the leather cord over his head. The ring dangled from it, catching the light, but he didn't hand it to Blackwood. He held it up between them, a symbol of defiance. This ring is not proof of your crime, Arthur said, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. It is proof that we survived. You did not erase us. You cannot erase the truth. The final confrontation was no longer just about a ring or a hidden past. It was about a man reclaiming his soul. And Amelia, standing behind him, her phone still recording, knew that whatever happened next, Alistair Blackwood had already lost. Alistair Blackwood looked from the ring dangling in the air to the defiant look in Arthur's eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his features. He was a man accustomed to buying, bullying, and litigating his way to victory. He didn't know how to contend with a man who had nothing left to lose and had suddenly found something worth fighting for. You are making a grave mistake, Blackwood said, his voice low and dangerous. He gestured to his bodyguard. Take the ring from him, and the phone from her. The large man, whose name was probably something simple and brutal like John or Mick, moved forward. He was a wall of muscle in a tailored suit, his expression blank and professional. Arthur stood his ground, frail in comparison, but his stance was unwavering. Amelia instinctively tightened her grip on her phone, her knuckles white. The small apartment suddenly felt like a cage, the walls closing in. But just as the bodyguard reached for Arthur, a loud, authoritative knock echoed from the apartment door, followed by a voice that cut through the tension like a siren. Mr. Blackwood, this is Detective Miller with the City Police. We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with an ongoing investigation. Please open the door. Blackwood froze, his head snapping towards the door. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pallor of pure shock. His bodyguard stopped in his tracks, looking to his boss for instructions. Amelia's mind reeled. The police? How? She hadn't called them. The knocking came again, harder this time. Open the door, Mr. Blackwood, or we will force entry. Blackwood shot a look of pure venom at Amelia, then at Arthur. This isn't over, he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. He quickly composed himself, smoothing his suit jacket, and walked to the door, opening it to reveal 2 uniformed officers and a plain-clothed detective. Detective, Blackwood said, his voice a smooth veneer of surprised innocence. What on earth is this about? I was just visiting a concerned friend. Detective Miller, a weary-looking man with sharp, intelligent eyes, ignored him completely. His gaze swept the room, taking in the scene. The hulking bodyguard, Amelia clutching her phone, and Arthur standing tall, the ring still in his hand. Miller's eyes lingered on Arthur for a moment, a flicker of recognition in their depths. We received a tip from an anonymous source, the detective said, his voice dry. A source who was very concerned about your sudden interest in a certain John Doe who frequents the downtown area. A source who also provided us with some very interesting information regarding the historical acquisition of your family's primary mining assets and their connection to a 60-year-old cold case. We also have a recording of the last 10 minutes of your conversation, thanks to the emergency alert triggered on this young lady's phone." He nodded towards Amelia. Amelia looked down at her phone in confusion. She hadn't triggered any alert. Then she saw it, a small blinking icon on her screen she'd never seen before. The detective's eyes found Arthur's. "We also have a sworn affidavit from a man in Marseille, on his deathbed, who has carried a secret for a very long time. The confession of a former soldier in the Eldorian Royal Guard. He was paid to look the other way on the night of the fire, and he's been running from that guilt ever since." Blackwood looked as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The carefully constructed world of his legacy was shattering, piece by piece, right in front of his eyes. "This is preposterous," he stammered, but the bravado was gone, replaced by the frantic edge of panic. "Is it?" Miller said calmly. He turned to Arthur. "Your Highness," he said, the title falling with practiced ease from his lips. "My apologies for the intrusion. My grandfather served under Captain Brandt. He was one of the men who helped you get across the border. My family has been watching, waiting for generations. We never gave up hope." It was then that Amelia understood. The anonymous source. The police arriving at the perfect moment. It wasn't a coincidence. There was a network, a hidden chain of loyalty that had stretched across 60 years, passed down from father to son, waiting for the moment the lost prince might resurface. Her confrontation in the cafe hadn't just exposed Arthur to his enemies, it had also alerted his hidden friends. The bodyguard, seeing the situation was lost, wisely put his hands up. Blackwood was sputtering, trying to bluster his way out, but Detective Miller simply read him his rights. As the officers led a stunned and defeated Alistair Blackwood away in handcuffs, the full weight of the moment descended upon the small room. The battle was over. In the days that followed, the story exploded. It was a media firestorm, a modern-day fairy tale with a dark criminal twist. "The Lost Prince of Eldoria, found homeless in city," the headlines screamed. Reporters camped outside Amelia's apartment building. Historians and government officials from 2 countries descended, all wanting a piece of the story. A piece of Arthur. But Arthur wanted none of it. He weathered the storm with a quiet, weary grace, with Amelia and Detective Miller acting as his fierce protectors. He gave one official statement, confirming his identity with DNA evidence and the testimony that Miller's network had gathered. He recounted the story of the fire, the assassination of his family, and the role of Blackwood Industries. The case against Alistair Blackwood was airtight, built on 60 years of his family's hubris and a 10-minute recording on a student's phone. The government of the country that had annexed Eldoria offered to restore his titles and grant him a lavish estate. Museums offered fortunes for the ring. But Arthur refused it all. "That life is gone," he told Amelia one quiet evening after the last of the officials had left. "I am not a prince. I am just Arthur. That is all I wish to be." He did, however, accept a settlement from the now disgraced Blackwood Industries, not for himself, but to establish a foundation, the Brandt Valerius Foundation, dedicated to helping the homeless and funding historical preservation projects. His first act was to ensure the Gilded Spoon, which had suffered from Blackwood's threatened boycott, received a generous anonymous donation. Months later, the world had mostly moved on, the story of the lost prince fading into the stuff of modern legend. Amelia finished her degree, her final thesis on the Eldorian succession crisis, earning her high honors and a job offer from the City Museum. One crisp autumn afternoon, she sat at a small outdoor table at a quiet, unassuming cafe, far from the city center. The coffee was good, the air was clean. A few minutes later, a man sat down across from her. He was tall, dressed in a simple but well-fitting tweed jacket. His grey hair was neatly cut, and his pale blue eyes were clear and calm. There were still lines of sorrow on his face, but for the first time they were joined by lines of peace. "Arthur," Amelia said, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Amelia," he replied, his voice smooth and steady. He placed a small velvet-wrapped object on the table between them. "I believe this belongs in a museum now, with a plaque that tells the true story." She unwrapped it. It was the ring. The Lion of Eldoria seemed to gleam in the afternoon sun, no longer a burden, but a testament to survival. He had found a small cottage in the countryside, not far from the city. He spent his days gardening, reading, and advising the foundation that bore his family's name. He was no longer a prince, nor was he a homeless man. He was simply Arthur, a man who had walked through the fire of his past and emerged on the other side whole. Amelia looked at him, her friend, the living embodiment of the history she so loved. He had not reclaimed a crown or a kingdom, but something far more valuable: his name, his truth, and his dignity. And as they sat there, two friends sharing a simple cup of coffee, she knew this was not an ending, it was a beginning. The story of Prince Arthurian was over. The story of Arthur had just begun.